So, wanted to talk about this. So, I've had a lot of community conversations around kind of this idea of Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter and that kind of stuff. And so, I thought it would make sense to at least try to have that conversation at Adler in these walls, because we're practitioners and we have families and friends, and so when we show up in the world, these kind of conversations come up, and people want to know what we think and how we think. And I don't think a lot of times we've given enough thought to what we think or how we think, or have background enough to talk about it intelligently. So, so we put this together. This is part 3 of our series. Yeah, you just grab one.
Sit between us, three on a couch for
Yeah, I just put them all around the couch.
Oh,
So
so I should have taken this.
no, it's all good. There's plenty. There's plenty.
Okay.
Almost too puffy.
So when you've heard people talk about this idea of Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter, what kinds of things come up for you when you or in what contexts have you heard conversations about Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter?
Well, probably haven't been keeping up on it lately, but I know originally there was some controversy between both those statements that you just said.
Yep. So there was controversy between All Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter.
Correct.
Yeah. And what do you think that controversy was, or what was the?
Well, I know it started with the guy running from Maryland. What was his name? He's out of the race now. Democrat from Maryland.
Oh, I'm not
Former
sure.
mayor of Baltimore.
Okay.
I can't remember his name though.
I don't remember his name either.
But anyways, he made a speech, and I think within it he said all lives matter. That's where I first started hearing about the controversy.
Okay.
And people from the initial movement objected to that statement.
Okay. Cool. Other folks.
the people of the original Black Lives Matter movement objected to that.
I believe
That's what
so.
you're saying.
I
Okay, I
believe
just want to
so.
make sure I understand what
Okay.
you're.
Cool. Other folks.
Well, I guess without truly following it, I mean, it's the two statements in and of themselves. It's kind of like, well, duh. Black lives do matter. Yes, absolutely. All lives matter. Yeah, absolutely. What's the controversy? But on the other hand, you're looking, like you say, context.
Context.
And when you're dealing with situations where there's crime involved, or it's perceived crimes, or that, how do we judge it in a manner that's going to bring about justice?
Yeah. For you, how have you?
I'm gonna be honest and say that I don't really follow the news very much. I just don't. So I haven't been paying attention. Like, I'm not following it. But I guess for me, I think what I understand about it is that they feel like the movement feels as though there's like profiling against them, especially like with the crime and their harsh treatment of Black people, and that they're kind of rising up and saying, you guys need to see how unfair it is.
Okay.
And everyone needs to.
Yeah.
Now, when I hear Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, to me that makes me kind of sad, because it's still separating them. I feel like it separates them from the all more than it does. That just grieves me a little bit.
Okay.
But I guess I don't totally understand why they want to differentiate in that way.
Yeah.
So I need more understanding.
Yeah. So those are legitimate ways, and that's why we're having these conversations, so that people can have more information about what those things mean, or how they can interpret those things. One thing I'd like to suggest is that, particularly for African Americans, and we touched a little bit about this in class, and we'll get more in depth in it the second half of class, is this idea that it's interesting when a minority group gets blamed for being separate when the conditions of their existence have been birthed in being separate, right? So an example I like to use is it's funny because people will say, well, why do so there's a television channel, I guess it's a channel now, station in the past, called BET, Black Entertainment Television. Have you heard of that? Okay, right. So people, it's funny because people will complain about that and say, well, why do Black people want to be separate? Why do they need their own separate television channel, if you will, or station, whatever? And when I hear that, I just smile and I laugh because Black Entertainment Television, and it's owned by the Johnsons, the original owners, was birthed out of a need to represent Black people in a way that they thought Black people need to be represented, as opposed to how Norman Lear or CBS or NBC said we want to portray Black people. So one of the things that happened, particularly with BET, was that during the boom of music videos and MTV started, they weren't showing Black videos of Black artists. And so the Johnsons, who also owned a magazine company, said, we see a market and we see a need. And so they started Black Entertainment Television. Now it's been sold and now it's more commercial and more like other people's stuff. And there's not much difference between that and other stuff. But its original intent was to address a need where Black people weren't being included in the media in the way they thought they should be represented. So they started their own thing. But now it gets turned around and says, well, they just want to be separate. Well, the birth of the activity was in response to already being separate. So this idea of Black Lives Matter comes out of the fact that people are, part of it is that people are saying that Black lives do matter. And it is about calling out what's separate, because what we find out when we look at the data is that Black lives are separate in a lot of ways in terms of any negative indicator you can find. There's a disproportionate number of Black lives attached to that number, be it abortion. Black people are 12% of abortions, but they're 12% of the population, but 38% of abortions happen in the Black community. That's a disproportionate number.
Okay,
right?
Can you say that again so I can understand?
So Black people are 12% of the population.
Okay.
Out of all abortions, 38% happen in that particular community, which if it was, tit for tat, it should be 12%, right? If it's going to be, so it's a disproportionate number. There's way more abortions happening there. The same with contact with law enforcement, imprisonment, unemployment, so-called education gaps. When you look at how Black people specifically are compared to their white counterparts, you see these huge discrepancies. The interesting thing, though, is if you compare Black people to other Black people, you see something quite different. So, and I'll get to some of that stuff in just a bit. But so, in my conversations, and we talked about this a little bit in our class. If you turn to page, and you guys will be a leg up on the rest of the folks because we're talking about this now, and I'll just carry it over into the class. But if you go to page 4, there's the preamble to the Constitution. And the preamble to the Constitution says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, we do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Love it. Love it. Wonderful words. But while these words are being penned, what activities are people participating in? What global economic activity were people participating in as they're penning this? The transatlantic slave trade, right? So what they're suggesting here is that, yeah, we want all of these things, but only for certain people. and it was typically people who either owned land or were wealthy, and usually those two things came hand in hand. And so, if you didn't own land and you weren't wealthy, then you weren't considered one of these folks yet. So we've done some things to try to rectify those things. So we also know that in 1830 there was the Indian Removal Act, which was to move all Native Americans west of the Mason-Dixon line, so really driving those folks west. Later in 1863, there was the Dawes Act, which said that the government could look at native lands, chop it up, and then individuals could sell their land to anybody that they wanted to. And that was really to try to undermine this idea that that Native Americans were a nation, so we can have them divide their land up individually, and they can sell it off individually. We could undermine the power of that nation. The other thing that also happened in the Dawes Act is that if Native Americans sold their land, they would get citizenship. They get all the rights that everybody else had as an American citizen, which meant that if you didn't sell your land, then you weren't a citizen. And that'll come into play a little bit later. So that comes into play a little bit later. So we're on page 4. And so 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation is signed. And what does the Emancipation Proclamation say? What does it do?
Frees all slaves that are slaves within the rebellious states.
That's right. So it frees the slaves that are in the southern states, right? We'll talk in class more about what this did, because the 13th Amendment to the Constitution then shortly follows this particular Emancipation Proclamation. And so we try to rectify some of those harms by freeing the slaves. But we actually create another problem that we see today, and we'll talk about that as well in just a second. And then in 1920s, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution is signed doing what? What does the 19th Amendment do? It gives women the right to vote, right? So women move from just being property to being property that can vote. I say that facetiously, but yeah, it gives women the right to vote. And then in 1924, the Polk Act is signed, P-O-L-K Act, which gives American Indians the right to be American citizens. It gives them the right to be American citizens, whether they sold their land or not, which is what the Dawes Act said. If you sell your land, you can be citizen. So without anything, they get the rights of citizenship. And then shortly after that, the war breaks out, and then we have Executive Order 966. And is anyone familiar with Executive Order 966 during World War II? Okay, that particular act created what I would refer to as concentration camps for Japanese Americans. And so that's when we had the internment camps for Japanese Americans. And so we took American citizens, nationals who identified as Japanese or who were thought to be Japanese, and took all of their property, all of their land, and interned them for I believe it was 2 years. And can you imagine if you have a store, you can't keep your store, so they sold their stores, they sold everything to be in these camps for 2 years. And what might that do to someone's morale? Yeah, right. And so when people talk about internment camps, it's a real thing, and it's not that far from the realm of possibilities that people could actually imagine, because it's happened in the past.
So what's interesting about that, though, World War II was not just against Japan.
No, it was not. But the Japanese were the only threats that we had, given the actions in Pearl Harbor, right? And it's something that, my grandfather talked about this in a number of documentaries. People will talk about this, that they would go fight in war, they would come back, they would even have prisoners of war, and the prisoners of war being German. And actually, as a matter of fact, in Minnesota, we had an internment camp for German prisoners. So German prisoners were here in Minnesota, and Black officers would talk about the fact that the German prisoners of war got treated better than they did as American citizens who fought in the war. And so, so this idea of race and racism is just really convoluted and quite
Would you say that last part again? Got treated better than?
better than the prisoners of war that they brought over. So the German prisoners of war were
Gotcha.
treated better than
Than who?
than African Americans
Oh, I see.
who fought in the war.
I got you.
So, so then we'll jump forward in time just a bit to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and the Civil Rights Act did two particular things, two things that are important and interesting. One is it outlawed segregation. It said that no longer could we have one part of our population relegated to this lifestyle, this way of being, these facilities, and then another for these facilities. So the idea of separate but equal was definitely tossed out with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The other thing that it did is it gave legal parameters to something that didn't have legal parameters before, which was this idea of discrimination. So the 64 Civil Rights Act defined discrimination and it outlawed segregation. All right, so those two things are important. In 1978, Native American Freedom of Religion Act is signed, so they have the ability to worship and have powwows and sun dances, however and whenever they deemed necessary, without without being arrested, without being accosted by government officials. So, in the land of the free and religious freedom, everyone had that freedom but Native Americans until 1978. And in 1990, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. And how many of you plan on getting old? Anyone here plan on getting old? Yeah. Then you will need the ADA, right? So so it is the ADA was with people with disabilities, but it also includes those of us who will have a disability at some point, right? So at the bottom of page 4 are just some ways to think about kind of affirmative actions, as I like to call them, as opposed to affirmative action as if there is one. And affirmative actions really focus on this idea of impact versus intent. So, so we look at numbers, we look at what things are, data, statistics, that kind of thing, without any regard to what people meant to do. Right? However, diversity and inclusion is really talking about, particularly in organizations, what are people's intentions and how do we create an environment where they can intend better so that people can have equal access to things. And then lastly, what we know is that relationships is what actually changes human behavior, not rules, not mandates, but actually having relationships with other people changes people's behavior. So there's that. Page 5 talks a lot more about this idea of intent versus impact. Page 6 talks about, we start dealing with bigotry, prejudice, and discrimination. We know that that bigotry is an emotional state, that prejudice is a thought process, and that discrimination is a behavior. And in cognitive behavioral therapy, what's the combination for either predicting or analyzing a person's behavior? What are the two factors that you think about in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy? Thoughts and feelings, right? So the way people think and the way they feel are predictive of their behaviors, right? And so when we think about discrimination, bigotry and prejudice are predictors of possible discriminatory behavior. And so we have to help people change their thoughts and their feelings to reduce the likelihood of them being caught in some kind of discriminatory behavior. All right. One thing I also like to talk about is where these things sit in the brain, because if we don't understand that, then we also miss another level of context, and that the limbic brain system really works on primary responses, right? So people are hungry, people are angry, they act out, and they behave in a particular kind of way, given their kind of wherever they are in the reptilian brain. And the reptilian brain, or the limbic system, was designed to keep us what? Alive, keep us safe, keep us alive. And so a lot of those functions operate with that as the highest goal. As long as it keeps me alive, as long as it keeps me out of danger, I'll be able to use those things. However, our prefrontal cortex was designed to make rational decisions about what that limbic brain is saying, right? So, for example, if I have to use the bathroom, I could very well just use the bathroom right here. My limbic brain might say, why not just do it here? You can do it here just as well as you can do it any other place. But my prefrontal cortex says, there are better places for me to do it than just here. I can go to the restroom and take care of that, right? So that's the difference between those two parts of the brain. And so what happens with people who suffer from bigotry is that they're stuck in their limbic brain, and everything is a danger. Other groups are danger. Difference is danger. And so they get frozen in that. Prejudiced people get caught up in a convoluted kind of thinking and not really analyzing what they've been told or how they're feeling in a way that's effective. And then discrimination is just the outcome of those two thought processes. Well, that emotional process and that thought process. Discrimination is a natural following out of that. So if we turn to page 7, and we'll talk more about this also in class, is that oftentimes, particularly people that we're working with, they feel a loss of humanity. I was when I was doing research for this particular piece, I was being inundated on my Facebook of police brutality. Now, I know police officers, I work with police officers, I've trained police officers, I know they're just as human as the rest of us. And so I was getting a double dose of sadness as I was watching these things throughout my Facebook posts. Sad for victims, but also sad for the officers who were not a part of what happened that this officer was a part of, but would have to deal with the aftermath of this officer's behavior that I'm seeing on YouTube, right, or Facebook or whatever. And so I was sitting with a lot of sadness, and then I started thinking, why am I sad? And then I started, getting angry about being sad. And then I started thinking, well, what's that about? And what I realized was that I was grieving the loss of humanity. That I was grieving the fact that I'm watching humans being reduced to video images, and then I'm watching my own humanity be reduced by not being able to have critical conversations about this stuff. And so I went to the 5 stages of grief to kind of look at that, to see where some of those things might be coming from, and how can I deal with my own loss of humanity, my own grief. And so on page 7 are the 5 stages of grief. First, there's denial. Then there's anger. Then there's this idea of bargaining, a sense of depression that you're starting to accept that loss is not there. And then finally, you get to a place where you accept and you're able to move on to the next stage. Well, when I started my own journey on this, I realized that that's exactly where Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter are on. They're on this continuum. And so at the beginning, if you look at the bottom of page 8, All Lives Matter is oftentimes referred to or connected to people who are in denial of what's going on. And so oftentimes you'll hear all lives matter proponents say, well, we know that's happening to Black people, but all lives matter. This is happening to all of us, and to a degree, they have a point. At the same time, without them being able to deny that what's happening to Black lives are unique and special and need some attention, then they're in that denial stage, right? And then you have Black Lives Matter who are very angry, and they're angry because people are denying the reality that they feel they see all the time. And so as you go through the stages of grief, what is there anything that's problematic? No, I'll just put it out there. Is it problematic to get stuck in one stage of grief? Yeah, it is, right? Because then you become maladaptive to the challenges that are in front of you. If you can't move through the stages, then you become truncated or bonsai'd, if you will, right? And so a lot of times, when people say all lives matter, they may be on a path, but they've chosen to just get stuck there. There are lots of Black Lives Matter who have chosen to just get stuck there, to that anger and that place is the only place that they operate in. And then there are those who are able to understand that this is a process, and they start moving through that process, and they can actually have conversations with people that they are diametrically opposed to. They can have conversations with people that they don't necessarily understand, but they do understand that if I have a conversation, that's how I will get understanding, right? And so that's where we start talking about this, the third stage of the third stage of grief, which is this idea of bargaining. We start having conversations with each other to get a better understanding of what's going on. And I put this term on here, and I guess it's probably a Gen X term or whatnot, because people didn't know what I was talking about. But you talk with your friends, and then you talk with your frenemies. Is anybody familiar with that term, frenemies? Right? Yeah. So frenemies are those people that always cause you problems, but they always want to hang out with you. They're always challenging what you have to say, and they doesn't seem like they're your friend, but they want to keep engaging you with that kind of stuff, right? And then there's this depression that we recognize that Black Lives Matter and all lives matter, but for different reasons, right? So they're both important, but for different reasons, and it's important to pull out both of those to talk about them. I also think, as kind of a rabbit trail on this, I think it's very interesting. Until people started saying Black Lives Matter, the only people talking about all lives matter were the pro-life people. Pro-life people were the only people talking about all lives matter until Black Lives Matter started saying Black Lives Matter, and then people started saying, well, all lives matter. Well, where were you when the pro-life people were saying all lives matter, right? And so when we think about that, we have to be cautious. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No.
But when you were talking about that in the beginning, in Black people are 12% of the population.
Yep.
And how many?
38% of
38%
abortions.
of abortion. Is that clash between the women's movement? And you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do know what you're saying. So this is what so going back to intent versus impact.
Yeah.
We can talk about intent, like who intended or how this thing was developed. I would like to address impact.
I'm not just saying it's all the women's movement. It could be about attitude, and Black lives don't matter.
So this is what I will.
Abortion on demand.
This is what I know.
Yeah.
What I know is that statistic is true. What I also know is that the way popular music portrays, particularly most young people, but specifically towards Black youth, there's a lot of partying and kind of freedom from modern conventions that are advertised in a lot of these music videos or movies or whatnot. A lot of what adults might say is irresponsible sexual behavior. And I would suggest that in those, and I've never seen, or it's very rare to see, let me qualify that, to see consequences for that behavior on TV or movies. Very rarely do you see consequences for that behavior. But in real life, those consequences are quite real. And so if I'm watching movies or listening to songs that promote violence or promote sexual promiscuity, there's no, in that piece of art, so to speak, there's no consequence for that.
It glamorizes.
They glamorize all this. Even MTV, Teen Moms. I don't know if you've ever seen that show, right? So the idea, back in the day, and back in the day, it may not have necessarily been good to demonize, but it certainly wasn't glamorized to the point that you could have that you talked about it openly, or that you had blah 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 blah. I know that there are tons of folks that I know that have become parents before they were ready, whatever that meant, right? Or and have made great lives for themselves and done some great things. But I think the shift that we've done in our popular media is that we glamorize things that aren't necessarily in our best interest. I don't know that financially it's in the best interest of young people to have children before they're prepared to do it financially. I don't know that that's what we glamorize, right? Or we'll make movies that glamorize. What's that?
Or we joke about it.
Or we joke about it, or those kinds of things. And those things aren't jokes. That's hardcore. So where does that stuff start? I would also, so there are some nefarious fingers in the soup, some nefarious spoons in the stir. For example, right now, African American birth population is at 0. White people's birth population is negative. Those kinds of things are problematic, right?
Okay, help me with what do you mean? Okay, so there are no black babies being born right now. Is that what you mean?
The number of black babies that are being born are equal to the black people who are dying. So the birth rate is at 0.
Okay.
So the growth of the birth rate is at 0. The population is staying steady, the same.
Okay, and it's decreasing for the.
And it's decreasing for white people, which I think is interesting, because I don't know if you've noticed, but there are a lot of twins. I was doing a presentation at a place in New Orleans, and there were 4 sets of twins, 2 of which were triplets. What does that say?
A lot of people dying.
A lot of people dying? What does it say?
It says, well, I think, if I know what I know about the occurrence of that, would be that a lot of people are going for in vitro.
They're going for in vitro. Why? Because people are infertile, right? So we have this epidemic of infertility that we have to address. And so some people have the financial resources, and this particular school that I was in the parents had the financial resources to do in vitro, and probably have done it more than one time, right? And so, to have triplets, that's a lot of money. To have twins, that's a lot of money. There's a lot of care that goes into that, on top of it, being in vitro. So, yes.
I just have a question about the abortion rate that you brought up, or you actually initially did. I fear in my questions that I come off ignorant. So
No.
if I at all seem ignorant in that, just
No, there's no offense.
But so when you say that then even though the population is like, so did you say it was 17% or 12%?
12%.
But then 38.
38.
Our abortion is I don't understand how I'm afraid but I don't see how that's discriminatory, because isn't abortion an elective, somewhat elective, or I just need help.
Yeah, I don't think I ever said it was discriminatory. Did I? I don't think I ever said.
Well, you were just saying the effects of things, and you used that in congruence. You said that with when you were saying about like I think talking about hiring, or no, you were talking about police brutality. You were like
Yes.
saying it in the same thing, and whereas I can see the one being discriminatory, the police brutality, versus the abortion rate, I have a hard time how those are.
Yep. So so the thread of logic that I was going along was that any negative aspect that you can look at, you will find that Black people are suffering in those kinds of ways. And I used abortion as an example. I was using police brutality as an example. I wasn't suggesting that they were discriminatory, although I would say that they are both oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
They're both oppressive. And voluntary is an interesting word, because there are lots of ways in which people volunteer.
Yeah, and so why is the Black community the higher rates? Help me. Is there a reason why? Do you know the effect or the cause of that?
I don't know specifically the cause of that. Which was going back to your thing about is it the women's lib movement? Is it sexual promiscuity? Is it the fact that our welfare state says if you have too many babies, we won't take care of them, or if you do have babies, we all those things. I don't know.
I've heard discussions on that, and it's not my opinion, just what I've heard, is that Black women seem to have more pressure on them to have abortions than other cultural groups.
Okay. I just didn't know. And
Yeah,
perhaps the white privilege allows young mothers to keep their babies or whatever.
Give them up for adoption, and all those kinds of things. And this is funny, because I was watching, it was a TV show, and a young lady had gotten pregnant. She's white, and her mother was like, "We're going to put your baby up for adoption." I don't know that in any of the networks that I've been in, or any of my family members, where they've gotten pregnant before they were prepared to do it, that adoption was really an option. Like, nobody ever talked about adoption as being an option. You're going to raise this baby. I mean, that was that. And so I would imagine that if the expectation is that you're going to raise this baby, and you're not ready, and all of these things, then the temptation between raising the baby and putting off having to deal with this to another time, that folks might do that. But I definitely think that so that's what I'll say. So that's, I think, and actually it's in the other book, this idea of contraceptives and what that stuff means. I think it gets played out in different communities in profound ways. So we'll talk about Norplant in class, because that certainly played out differently for the folks who was tested on than for the folks who use it as a, blah, blah, blah. So,
well, if someone in Beverly Hills wants to get an abortion versus someone in the Bronx, it might be a whole different process, whole different counseling session, whole different. I don't know.
yeah, I don't know either.
I'm just
So
thinking out loud.
yeah. So again, that's why I have to look at the impact and not spend too much time on the intent. Although the intent is important, but I have to focus on the impact, because the intent could take me down some really interesting rabbit holes, rabbit trails. So let's flip over to page 10. Just want to address these things. So one of the things that I know is happening is that, particularly for African Americans or Black people, that there's this deep sense of hurt that happens, and the hurt actually comes from the constant or continued betrayal of the United States not to fulfill what they said they would do, right? So, so you know, 1863 at the Emancipation Proclamation, that was the first time. That wasn't the first time. Reconstruction was supposed to happen right after that. Um, Black leaders got positions, were part of building communities, all that kind of stuff. And then Reconstruction got too expensive and it fell apart. And so things went right back to where they were right after 1863. And so there's this, and events, particularly for African Americans, that have led to the consistent distrust of the American government or the system. And again, I'm speaking for a percentage of the population. Stuff like the Tuskegee experiments, where people thought they were getting treatments when in fact they weren't getting treatments. And in some cases, they were even being infected with the disease that they were supposed to be treated. And that was allowed to happen by government entities, right? So that's not a glitch. We, as African Americans, also watched the kinds of things that happen to other groups, right? So all of those things create this deep-seated hurt. And the Koreans use a word called Han to kind of define that deep, resentful hurt. And so, so Han is a sorrow caused by heavy suffering, injustice, or persecution. It's a dull, lingering ache in the soul. It is a blend of lifelong sorrow and resentment, neither more powerful than the other. Han is endued with resignation, bitter acceptance of grim determination, and so this is so for a segment of the population, this is the hurt, right? And so when that hurt's not addressed, it re-victimizes people. So the folks who say, Black Lives Matter, and they hear someone say all lives matter, it takes them back to this Han place, right? You're not listening to me. You're hurting me too. You're not, you don't see where I'm coming from. While simultaneously, Han doesn't, you can get so deep and caught up in Han that you can't see the positive, right? So this sorrow becomes so overwhelming that you can't see the positives. So there's that. I talked a little bit about this idea of diversity fatigue in class, and I always find it interesting. This pops up on my Facebook feed every so often that, on Jeopardy, they do, in February, they do Black History trivia, and nobody ever picks not ever, but oftentimes, but that's the last category to pick is African American history, right? And why are these intelligent people not picking this particular category? That's an interesting question, right? I don't necessarily have an answer for it. I have some suspicions, but I don't have an answer for that. And so a lot of people will talk about this idea of diversity fatigue. We know that these things are problems. Why do we have to keep talking about it? Well, we should probably keep talking about it until they're not problems any longer, right? So, in terms of changing our behaviors, particularly as a young person, that's how a lot of my behaviors got changed. People kept talking to me about my behaviors. They kept questioning my behaviors and encouraging me to change my behaviors until that actually happened. We'll talk about the 13th Amendment in class because that's been a kind of a Trojan horse for how we see the world today. If you were asked, are there more Black men in college or in prison? What might be your answer? Prison, right? Typically. And I'm not saying your answer specifically, but the most popular answer is typically prison. And unfortunately, that's not the truth. The truth is actually the converse. And the question itself is problematic. What is the age range of a college student?
18 to 22.
18 to 22, and we can go to 25 if you want, right? So 18 to 25. what's the age range of a person who can be held in the county jail, in a prison? What's the age range?
18 and up to whatever.
18 to death, right? So we're not, even when people ask, are there more black men in college or in prison? They're not asking an apples to apples comparison in the question. So the question is already skewed. So if I said prison, I would be right in that I'm not comparing apples to apples. But when we do compare apples to apples, we find the converse to be true, that there are more black men in college than there are in jail or prison. And so why is one narrative favored over the other? We have to go back to all human behavior being purposeful. So if I can convince people that they are less than human, then maybe they'll act less than human. So then I can have a self-fulfilling prophecy. But then if I can also simultaneously convince people to treat people less than human, maybe I'll get a self-fulfilling prophecy in that. And so then I keep the status of the system that I've created, right? So that becomes an important narrative to pierce through a number of the things that are presented to us and really ask critical questions. Does this make sense? Are these things real? And where is this data in this foundation coming from? So for example, this particular piece comes right out of the Justice Department. And in jail, there were for 2012, there were 793,000 people black men in jail, but there were 1,456,000 black men in college or university, right? So yeah, that's important to recognize it and talk about. On page 11, we need to talk also about this idea of whiteness. And a lot of times people get that concept confused because they'll use words like white privilege. Has anyone ever heard someone use that, white privilege? Well, white privilege as a concept is problematic for me because it's hard for me to think about or talk to my white kids in Frogtown. You guys know where Frogtown is?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's over in St. Paul, between 94 and it's right off of 94 before you get, what's that? Like Pierce Butler, Snelling.
Between like Capitol.
Yeah, between the Capitol and University in the University of Minnesota, right? So if you want to think about that whole thing as possible Frogtown, whatever, but the midway area of St. Paul, just working class white folks, right? And you say, and I tell them that they have privilege. How would my working class white folks respond to this notion that they have privilege?
Well, yeah. Use myself because we just bought a house in the Midway.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Do you have privilege?
maybe some,
Maybe
But-
some.
but I'm white, and in many ways, I don't feel privileged because we can't buy a house. We can't afford to buy a house in Highland.
Okay, so therein lies the problem with white privilege. Not all white people are created the same. Not all white people are created the same. What do white people call white people who don't measure up to the level or sophistication that most white people think they should?
Rednecks.
They call them rednecks. What else? Trailer trash, right? This is white people talking about other white people, right? So when we think about this idea of even white privilege, the white kid in the hoodie, does he have the same access to privileges as Secretary of State John Kerry? Probably. Depends on his dad and stuff like that, but probably not, right? So we're making lots of assumptions when we look at these pictures. Remember Joe the plumber? You guys remember that in the electric, right? Does he have the same access to privilege as Mitt Romney? Probably not, right? Anyone see The Great Gatsby? right? So yeah, he faked it, but ultimately it came down to his so-called pedigree, right? So so those things are important. So when we say all lives matter, if all lives matter, there'll be certain things that would be true. There would be certain things that would be true. So I found it interesting that Mark Zuckerberg asked his employees to stop replacing Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter. And he did that because he wanted to recognize the challenges that were happening for Black folks and not just try to whitewash those things. If all lives matter, we would have some equity in education. If all lives matter, women still, to this day, would not be paid 75 cents to the dollar that a man is paid, if all lives matter, right? And so there are lots of things that we say, but we really haven't demonstrated or really executed very well when we take on some of these slogans and some of these ways of being. And so lastly, I'd like for you to just pay attention at the bottom of page 11 to the models of liberation. And when does true and authentic liberation happen, given that particular model? When there's one standing, okay?
Can you ask the question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So when does authentic or true liberation happen? Which one of those smaller pictures?
All right, I'm sorry. I think maybe not the best visual person, but I'm trying to figure out what you're trying to say with these images here.
Yeah.
What's the structure of it?
Yeah. So what do you think that structure thing is?
Is that
Hierarchy?
a table?
It kind of looks like a table, but
Okay.
they're standing on it.
So we'll say that it's a table.
Okay.
So where does authentic liberation